Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today to this event to mark the launch of Khairani Barokka's new work, Molekuler. Khairani goes by Oka. I'm Bárbara Rodríguez Muñoz, and I'm curator of the Wellcome Collection, and I'm also really excited to be your host for this evening. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. The event is being recorded and will be available to watch again on Wellcome Collection's YouTube channel. We have live speech-to-text from stage texts, and the conversation and poetry will be interpreted to British Sign Language after the event, and this will be available to watch on our YouTube channel. Oka and I will self-describe ourselves, and after a short introduction, we will play a recording of Oka sharing 3 poems and images from her new work, Molekuler. And then Oka and I will be in conversation, and I always have too many questions for her, but I'll try to make it short and open up to you through the questions in the chat. You can either post a question in the chat on YouTube, you can drop us a message via Slido, and the link for this is about to be shared in the chat, I hope. Our moderators are on hand to support you if you're struggling with the platform or if you need some support. Just comment in the chat box and we'll get in touch. And then finally, the event is an hour long and the chat is now open. I'm going to describe myself. I'm a Mediterranean woman with dark, wavy, shortish hair. I'm wearing a white shirt and I'm in my living room surrounded by plants and books and records. And I work as curator at Wellcome Collection. And for those who are not familiar, Wellcome Collection is a free museum and library in London that explores health and being human, making connections across science, medicine, life, and art. Over the last couple of years, I have also edited the document of contemporary art anthology on health, which is co-published by the MIT Press and Whitechapel Gallery. And it brings together artists and writers like Oka, whose practice addresses health, access, and care. So I've been working with collections, with thinkers and artists on these issues, problematizing them, expanding them, from projects that deal with chronic illness and healing to the climate breakdown and ecology, while exposing the colonial and patriarchal narratives that have shaped our medical collections at Wellcome. I first came across Oka's work doing an event at the London-based art gallery Raven Row, and the event was titled Seek Time is Resist Time. In this event, Oka performed a poem alongside extracts from her book Indigenous Species, which is a poetry art book addressing issues of pollution, consumerism, and habitat destruction. I'm always fascinated by Oka's ability to draw connections between ableism and racism, drawing from personal experiences as an Indonesian artist based in London to open up in an expansive and visceral way to social and environmental justice more globally. Oka's new work is titled Molekuler and is part of Wellcome's COVID-19 commissions. The teams at Wellcome started working on this program around May 2020 at the peak of the pandemic, when we all started to learn more about the real consequences of COVID-19. We were committed to work with artists who have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and the public health messaging, so chronically ill, disabled, and racially minoritized artists who were currently reflecting on their own experiences or capturing the experiences of others. The aim was both to support them in a moment of dramatic crisis, but also to think about our future audiences and researchers being able to find in our collections a selection of counter-narratives to the official data and media representation of the pandemic in the UK, so to fill in the gaps of our future collections. And Oka's poignant and moving response was Molekuler. It is based on an accessible image, text, audio artwork exploring how the word hidden has manifested in the COVID-19 pandemic across different interlinked environments and contexts. So with hidden, she refers to the deaths, how they've been depersonalized, hidden disabilities, hidden links between power structures, and so on. The project involves 5 prose poems, each in the voice of a different molecule, so earth, cloth, blood, paper, money, vaccine. These molecules from colonial times speak to each other in the present day in dialogue and connecting their lives with COVID-19. So now we're going to play 3 pre-recorded poems, Paper, Money, Earth, and Vaccine in this order. And then we'll move on to our conversation and the Q&A with you. And just to add, in terms of accessibility, the poems that Oka is reading are meant to be captions, which describe the images that we are showing. And thank you.
My name is Khairani Barokka. As mentioned, I go by Oka. I am a brown Indonesian woman with earrings and my hair tied back in a ponytail, and I'm wearing a red, brown, and black batik patterned dress with a blurred background behind me. Thank you so much, Barbara, and everyone involved with this event and with the commission. I'd like to give a special thanks to my access aide, Shura Devi Joseph Bruner. I am going to read 3 prose poems that describe 3 images that will be shown on the screen. So the first is entitled Paper Money. I should also say there are 5 of these images that correspond, each of them corresponds to a different prose poem. So their titles are Paper Money, Earth, Blood, Vaccine, and Mass Cloth. So I'm going to be reading 3 of those 5 poems and descriptions for the images now. Paper Money. I map my station in geometric coherence of the senseless, reddened bottom triangle opposing an upper triangle of bluish-purple hues. Against both triangles, pixels lay claim from bare ends. Paper money, garish, grotesque, unbidden, unhidden, generates barrage of pixels without relent. Against the upper blue triangle and against the lower red triangle both, pixels cut and altered, chopped and screwed. From news images showing Iranian hospitals buckling under maximum pressure, quote-unquote, sanctions from the US. From a graph showing deaths spiking hard in Iran. I map my station as a molecule of paper money that determines how likely proper medicine, masks, equipment will be available to you in Shahadai Tajrish Hospital, Tehran. I map my station amidst pixels from news images showing Israel's jets hitting occupied Palestinian territory, specifically Gaza, specifically the home of 1.2 million Palestinian refugees, specifically where the UN has deemed over 90% of Gaza's water unfit for human consumption. Later, a pandemic enters. I map my station amidst pixels from a photo of Isaac Levito, from a photo of MP Richard Drax eating ice cream, vanilla, amidst pixels showing his Barbados estate, where slaves were tortured and died, and a UK one with a gate upon which are deer bucks. Ice cream. Ayanda Capital's co-founder is in these pixels, profiteer of inadequate masks. COVID chamocracy. Paper money. In the lower right-hand corner in blue Indonesian script, uangmu berdarah. Pixel shocks, and I map my station. So this next poem is entitled Earth. I map my station, earthen. I am molecule of dirt, soil mess of mineral cave of fertile spores. Against orange background so bright you can barely see my station's complexity, but within this bloom, the stories of pixels, as gradations from disparate biomes. From occupied Papuan territory under Indonesian rule, the largest gold mine in the world, Freeport-McMoRans. Miners tested positive early on, mine tailings poison groundwater, have been leaching death, who descends upon the mine in another, newer form. From Tory MP Richard Drax's Barbados estate and his British estate, both grounds maintained by human slavery. Observe how fond some are of holding sentences for death and profound injury in the earthen pitch, in the brick. From China, industrial factory farming since the 1990s has spread in paw-like formations further. The Guardian reports a spatial epidemiologist saying, there is clearly a link between the emergence of highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses and intensified poultry production systems. Tell me what is supposedly hidden. These the layers of organic remains that persist, the supposed ownership of which determines who decides who lives and dies. These are the rock and clay particles that are named and claimed by murderous theft, reddish-yellow rampage continuing apace. Pixels from various foods for feeding, from mineral laptop of coltan blood, from maps for environmental investigations. The earthen is gouged in mechanical brutishness. Plantations grow more forms of wreckage. I map my station in green, connects to a human palm's worth of green rainforest against the neon blitz of destructive means. I am indigenous people's shrinking safety, the green of rightful home and of metaphysics, irreducible to nature, quote unquote, as described in colonial taxonomy. The stars see the spread of dense green earth from above, the upper right-hand corner of their visual frame. Below them, the stars see the vast sprawl of neon, invading rapaciously. Tell me what is supposedly hidden, and from my rainforest station, under siege, I will show you how you were perhaps simply the very last to know. This last poem is entitled Vaccine. I map my station. Amidst a dark, twisting smoke plume of vaccine manufacture, when staffed and located in the majority world, those who produce vaccines may well have no access to them. Most of the world waits until 2022 for their turn. I am a molecule inside a vaccine. I map my station and I am waiting. These factories, the one from which my smoke plume rises, are filled with many shapes symbolizing vaccines. The skyscraper city they're drawn within is surrounded by barbed wire made of symbols for the patented vaccines. So patented are they. I am waiting. Rich countries have swooped vaccines into the arms of its citizens, and others are hindered by virtue of fascism pressed upon vaccines. Eugenicism means a small percentage of the world is deemed perfect, the rest to be eliminated. Why wouldn't we think vaccination queues would be implemented along these lines? Waiting. Disabled people, the largest minority in the world, are in virtually every country treated as though we should expect to die, as though we should feel fine about massacre. I am here. Beyond the barbed wire of Vaccine City in the lower right-hand corner, the rectangle is swarmed by pink-orange pixels. From news photos and articles decrying a regime of vaccine inequality. These pixels are from photos of areas where vaccines for COVID-19 are far scarcer than those in the UK or the USA or Canada or Australia, or the outline of a mouth and nose and two closed eyes, and grief repeats. 3 columns from the left side inwards, yellow, pink, and green, against the backdrop of these pink-orange pixels. And I map my station in neon blue. I am here, waiting. I am waiting alongside all these stations, breathing in the smoke.
Thank you very much, Oka. I really love how the words describe, act as captions of the image, what you see in the image, but also what is hidden behind the pixels. And it's so poignant how they connect COVID-19 with social and environmental violence. Thank you very much for saying them. I'm going to introduce you now briefly. I'm going to quickly read Oka's biography. Khairani Barokka is a writer, poet, and artist born in Jakarta and based in London. She's a practice-based researcher whose work centers disability justice as anti-colonial practice. She's currently research fellow at the University of the Arts London, the Colonizing Arts Institute, associate artist at the National Centre for Writing, and associate artist at the FINA Foundation. Hi, Oka. It's lovely to share the virtual stage with you again.
Yes, always a pleasure, Barbara. Thank you. And thank you to Wellcome, and once again to Shura Joseph Gruner for access, aid, and advice.
So yeah, it's great to be together again. I hope we get to be together in person at some point. And we are going to have a 50 minutes conversation or so, and then I'll be reading some of the questions from the chat and from Slido as well. So bear with me. I hope I can manage the three things at the same time. But firstly, I would love to start with you talking a bit about the phrase, I map my station, which I read as a way of bringing the performative, the poem, and the image together.
Yes, so I knew that I wanted the 5 images and the 5 poems to be interlinked. I wanted them to be seen as part of a series together. And I thought, well, how do I map the station of each of these molecules, because the poems are spoken in the voice of molecules of earth or vaccine or blood, etc. And I thought, oh, that's a sentence. I map my station. The molecules are mapping themselves as to where they are in different biomes. And so that sentence became the connecting part of both the poems and the images, because I thought, well, if I just wrote, I mapped my station 5 times, and then I manipulated it so that it would be in different parts of each of the images. So that was a connecting thread that shows how all of these are actually the same crisis and nothing is actually hidden. It's all right there. And I was really fascinated by the usage of this word hidden as well, because you hear people say things like, wow, the deaths of disabled people as a genocide in this pandemic are really hidden. And it's like, you're talking over 60% of the deaths of over 100,000 people. That's not hidden at all to the families and friends and communities of those people. And so it becomes hidden to whom and by what mechanisms is that deliberately hidden from people, and who gets to say what's hidden and what's not. So I kind of wanted to push back against sort of this hegemony of the quote unquote hidden as a mechanism, calling something hidden as a mechanism.
Yeah, we were talking about this now at the beginning of working together and with the colleagues at Wellcome in this commission, and you were also sharing with us references from media that precisely kind of argue against this idea of things, events, people, deaths being hidden. So I think it'll be very interesting for our audiences to hear a bit more about those media references and where they come from, and some of the stories that you found, and how you map them to your own station as well, not just the one of the molecule.
Yeah, I guess you could say that, right? So for some of these images, you might not look at Earth, for instance, which is very, sort of neon graphic, almost block colors, and think this is a collage, but it is a collage because of the way I have taken news images from various aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic that deal with Earth and how extractive capitalism, colonial capitalism, has worsened this pandemic, has literally shaped the contours of this pandemic on an earthen scale. I think that I wanted to sort of redefine for myself what collage is, and to use it in a different, more subtle way in terms of which images I chose, what I did to them. But I also wanted to make each image stand out in terms of the caption, which is the poem, to deliberately say, in this Earth image is an image from the largest gold mine in the world, which is in Indonesia, which has, disenfranchised a lot of local Papuans. And unfortunately, earlier this week, there was likely poisoning of a local government official who was very staunchly anti-gold mine in Indonesia. So extrajudicial killings of anti-mine activists are not anything new. They've been going on, for ages in Indonesia during the New Order regime and after. And I've always seen that link in my life between, environmental activism, the threat to human life, and the endangering of people, and the sickening of people, and the disabling of people, and the lack of protection for people who are disabled. And that has never been hidden to me since I was a kid. And I just, I realized when I realized what is hidden to other people, because we all have things that we think are hidden to us. Definitely including myself, I have things that I think might be hidden from me, to sort of query, well, what are the mechanisms by which these are hidden? And just because you may not be able to see the outline of a gold mine in this photo doesn't mean that it's not very much there. The orange sort of symbolizing the toxicity of the extractivism, and the green symbolizing the safe spaces, the refuges that are rapidly diminishing.
Well, and they are hidden for some people, and for others are not, and until they are exposed, not like it's brutally happening with COVID-19.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that there are a lot of ways in which COVID-19 relates to agriculture. When I was doing the research, that I hadn't even thought of necessarily, like factory farming in China, contributing to the increase in viral transmission from animals, and lack of food security and all of this stuff. So there's so many more aspects that I'm sure I haven't covered in these 5 pieces of COVID-19 that stretch and will stretch, for some time to come.
And going back to this idea of hidden and the pixelated aesthetic, how did you decide how much to expose, how much to reveal, how much to hide, how much to pixelate? Because some images have far more detail, while others, like Earth, is more about kind of this sheer contrast between the toxic and the green, in a way.
Yeah. Some do have, so there are images, for instance, of people in paper money, where I think you can see they're like small figures, but I've made their heads into this sort of like orange cloud that connects all the paper money parts. And there are some news images there from like bombings of Gaza that were so orange because of, it's so strange, but the blue and the orange motif for news imagery of war across the board, I found was really common. And I decided to use that. And then I also noticed like the blue uniforms of people who are like nurses and doctors in hospitals, but also of, Tory MPs who are wearing like blue 3-piece suits, and the blue of masks, and the blue. So it just became sort of following the threads and where they wanted to go. I know that's artists are not always very precise with their.
Well, it's instinctive as well, right?
It is, yes. I think that's the word for it. It is instinctive, and I think that I was careful to treat each, although they are related, to treat each image according to the direction that sort of either the poem or the image would be pulling me in a certain direction, and sometimes the image and the poem would be working together to pull me into a certain way of writing or a certain visual motif.
Yeah, and it's amazing because I've been reading the poems in different ways, and they kind of become some sort of like polyphony of this kind of entanglements of violence. And I don't know, in a way, they really kind of like, in a way, it becomes quite kind of disturbing, no? Disturbing to see how all these kind of forces being interconnected through the repetition of the words and through the kind of the images being pixelated. But I really love how then you think about the work being accessible, how you talk about access being generative as opposed to something that you add later on, and kind of the transparency and the generosity of the way that the text describes the image to a degree. And I know that this is something that you've done in the past and that you always tend to do. So it'd be great. I think it'd be great for people to hear more about this approach, because it could really inform museum practice and other artists.
Yeah, sure. So this isn't something that only I have done. It's something that disabled and chronically ill artists around the world have all been doing in different ways in many different languages, because I think we recognize that access is generative and access is a creative act, right? And in terms of audio description, in terms of captioning, there's a way in which sometimes museology can really reify this very static colonial enlightenment sort of taxonomy for things. So, like painting of a red ball against a white background, but that could be the flag of Japan, or that could be, there's so many ways you can interpret paintings. I mean, obviously, that's what curators do, right? Is to find all these many different threads. And so for the past decade or so, I've been trying to approach captioning in creative ways, and whether it is through making an entire one-woman show, a spoken word piece about what is happening to the paint on my body, or books like Indigenous Species, where there's fake Braille, quote unquote, on the left-hand side to sort of highlight. It's a translation of absence. So I also see access as a form of translation, and those two practices as being very much of a piece. I think that translating something like the vaccine image, for instance, where if somebody didn't know what it was, they might say there's, a smoke plume with barbed wire, but I want to highlight that barbed wire was made from, multiplying many times the sort of RNA symbol that was used to symbolize different vaccines. And there are the vaccine symbols inside the skyscrapers to sort of show that this is about the vaccine industrial complex and vaccine apartheid. And to have the background outside that barbed wire to be made up of images from various places that are really hard hit by the vaccines. And then also little things like including, there's a part of, I think, a couple of the skyscrapers in the barbed wire that have a little bit of blue in them. And those blues are from pixels from the background to show that, let's say, a factory in South Africa that creates vaccines, those factory workers may not have the same access to the vaccines they help create. That it's not a matter of just, the West produces vaccines, but actually vaccines are produced in countries that may not have access to whose citizens may not have access to them. Yeah. And I love what you said about polyphony of voices. That's exactly what I hoped for, because I imagine like this choir of 5 little molecules. So thank you. You made my day. I think I've achieved.
But when we are talking about this access as generative, and you're saying that, yeah, definitely many other artists are working in this way, but what is very particular, I think, for you is because you move within poetry. I mean, you move from poetry to the performative to visual arts, right? So in a way, that's, I think, why it works so beautifully. I think, so following from this thread, I think it'll be very interesting for audiences to learn how your writing or your poetry informs your practice, and then your practice informs your research, and like how it creates this kind of endless loop, which is really embodied by this new commission.
Oh, thank you. So I describe myself as a practice-based researcher, meaning I research by making. There are so many things that I don't discover until I start sketching or photographing or messing about in Photoshop or writing a poem. And there are connections between visuality and tonality and sound and the text as the materiality of pixels also is something that I really, really relished being able to dive into with this particular commission, because it was important to me that all the pixels were mostly in those images are all mostly taken from news images of what they're describing, and it was really it was really exciting to and also to think alongside Shura. Thank you, Shura. I see you in the comments. Wonderful access aid to sort of and thank you also for bearing with my, so at times maybe erratic, like, oh my gosh, change everything, oh no, I've had an epiphany. Please help me. Yeah. So it was really, I wanted to show that we take pixels and the interchanging of pixels and the communication through pixels and the mediation through pixels and tossing pixels back and forth so casually these days. Maybe in the past decade, right? That kids these days, they go on TikTok. I mean, how many different pixels are being exchanged by like one 14-year-old on TikTok every day, right? And I wanted to really bring it back to the materiality of the pixels and think about the ethics of that. So if I'm going to take green from a photograph of a rainforest that is under threat, or if I take that green or if I take a brown from an aerial image of a rainforest that has been demolished, how do I responsibly write about that pixel, about those pixels, because I think with collage, something that I've always struggled with and hope I do as ethically as possible is collage is appropriating from one image to create a whole new image. But I think that so often these days, I mean, not just in terms of pattern, I mean, I'm wearing a batik dress, not just in terms of traditional patterns being used in ways that by people who don't know what they mean, right? But in terms of the actual way that news image pixels, and I used to be a journalist and I couldn't hack it. Also a return to that, like thinking about how news images every day are being shared on social media, are being, we will see like a really tragic video and think it's okay to look at and share when maybe it hasn't been approved by the family of the victim, right? When maybe or of the survivors or whatever is involved, when maybe it's not ethical to reproduce an image according to a certain community because that image is sacred or something, I think in colonial capitalism, the assumption is that everything is for everyone to use all the time. But I think especially if you are attuned to indigeneities, it's like, no, actually you have to be like, I'm trying to be a bit more intentional with the materiality of pixels.
And you're giving it context as well, no? Through giving that information, which is important, because then the works form part of a collection and they're hopefully there for the researchers of the future. So you don't want that context, that very current context.
I think it was also sort of a pushing back against how I, along with, many millions of people, use the internet every day. Like, I'll be scrolling through the news and then like, oh my God, there was this terrible accident. And then the next minute be making breakfast. Like, it just seems there's a strangeness to it. And there's like a callousness, to the way we treat those images sometimes. So I think I wanted to get to sort of have the pixels speak and really have them expand from one pixel outward. What would a pixel say? Sorry, I see some images in the chat.
I'm gonna read some questions here. I think we can open up to the audiences now. So the first comment is by Shura D, and it says that it was a pleasure to work with you, Oka.
Likewise, Shura, thank you so much. It wouldn't have been the same without you and your infinite patience with me.
And then the second question says, well, comment first, powerful and beautiful work. What has helped you to get through the last year?
Oh, what a question. Okay, so what has helped me to get through?
I was thinking about because there was something else I wanted to ask you, so maybe connects to this, the book that you published in spring.
Yes, in Ultimatum Orangutan or Ultimatum Orangutan. Yes, I have it right here. Okay, what you're witnessing is me literally using my foot to get this book up. I'm very proud that I just did that. I just literally used my.
And you didn't shift too much. You really kind of kept balance.
Cirque du Soleil, watch out. Okay, so this is the cover for the book, which is also a collage. So in the background is an image of Tanah Datar, which is the area in West Sumatra where my mom's village is. And it's the largest matrilineal culture in the world. So
maybe bring it closer to your face. There. Yeah, because it was a bit blurred. I see the hand. It's hand now.
With 9 arches press, and it's my hand sort of with like a Hadouken energy against a bulldozer. And the background is also like cloth that comes from my family and has significant meaning. So again, I've been trying to be a bit more intentional with pixels. In the past, I've used pixels that have been meaningful to other cultures and trying to use them ethically. And this time, I think I've been using more of stuff from my heritage. And this book is about how colonialism has created climate change because of the Industrial Revolution being imposed upon current and former colonies, and how that aspect of the conversation, climate justice, not only in terms of debt that is owed to countries in terms of climate change prevention and mitigation, but also in terms of palm oil is something that I feel really passionate about. Indonesia is the largest producer of palm oil, and I don't believe I have friends who believe in sustainable palm oil. I personally, because I know the legal loopholes that palm oil plantations go through, I do not believe there can be sustainable palm oil. And a lot of what you see as sustainable, some of it it's on land that was previously deforested. And we use it every day in our soaps, shampoos, toothpaste, chocolates, ramen noodles. It's endless, the amount of things and it doesn't even say palm oil a lot of the time. It's like sodium lauryl sulfate, SLS, right? For instance, or other derivatives of palm oil. And what I think, actually thinking in terms of Molekuler.
And hidden.
Yes, exactly. So to me, that violence, because I grew up really, really emotionally close to the violence that plantations have on my communities and other communities in Indonesia, especially indigenous communities. I really feel palm oil as a violence, but people need to survive. And unfortunately, those are the cheapest products made available, right? That's the system has made it. So the cheapest products available are products that, and they will never say that your soap contributed to the demolishing of an entire ancient rainforest system of cosmology, displaced this many millions of people, killed this many millions of people, had this many people killed extrajudicially or violently intimidated or raped or kidnapped, or none of that is in the soap, right? And it's so strange coming from that context and then being like in the UK where people don't really think about that, or there are terms like, as long as it's vegan is fine, as though palm oil, which is also technically vegan, right, doesn't come at the harming of people. And also, orangutan means person of the forest in Indonesian. Orang means person or people, utan means forest. So when you say orangutan, you're also talking about people. But a lot of times when I hear people want to talk about rainforest destruction in Indonesia, they always go to orangutans. And I'm like, so many people. Like, it's so strange that I love orangutans. And I think that the indigenous peoples of the rainforest are the best possible protectors of orangutans, as the UN acknowledges. But then it's also this weird thing of people care more about the orangutans than about us as people, which is very strange. And that comes, I think, from this artificial separation of nature, mind, and body that indigenous scholar Zoe S. Todd writes about, that colonialism brings, right? Nature is separate from human. And it's like, I can't even say the word orangutan without also talking about people, right?
But it's going back to these taxonomies that also museums reinforced,
yes,
that have created that separation, which is an artificial separation.
Or nature writing as not political, right? Nature writing is apolitical. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was just thinking when you were talking about the impact of palm oil or everything we do, there is this very interesting concept in this book called The Second Body. And the book is by Daisy Hildyard. And so it's about how we have a second body. And so everything we do when we make a cup of coffee, there is a second body that is having an impact somewhere else in the world, and that impact is often violence. No, so I found it like a very powerful kind of metaphor to be more aware of daily acts. But related to what you were saying regarding Indonesia, I think there is a question, so we can try to kind of follow the thread of the conversation and bring the public in. There's a question in the chat which says, what is the public conversation in Indonesia about the pandemic, disability and colonialism? And then how is this different to these topics and how they're discussed in the UK? I really wanna know what you think about this.
So I think in the UK, as in Indonesia, there's rampant eugenicist ableism that has resulted in a massacre of disabled people in this pandemic. And I'm grateful to Wellcome for this opportunity, because so often it is not our voices that are being centered, even though disabled women in the UK are 11 times more likely to die in the pandemic, which is a heinous amount of times over to be more vulnerable to death. But we're often not centered, and we're often written about rather than being highlighted. And I think that's the same in Indonesia. It's the same in the UK. I actually just...
But in terms of the discourse, is the discourse different?
Yeah. I think that actually it's very similarly thought of as hidden, right, quote unquote. And also, earlier today, I was being interviewed by an undergrad student at the University of Indonesia who is not disabled, but is doing her thesis in criminology on ableism in the media through a criminological lens, like ableism as violence, which is really fascinating. And she hadn't heard about ableism until there was a talk I did a year ago in Indonesian. And she's like, yeah, it's been really difficult to get consensus from different disabled people in Indonesia about different aspects of portrayals that are ethical. And I said, well, of course, because disability isn't a monolith, right? Just because, just like women aren't a monolith or Indonesian people aren't a monolith, you're going to get in disability studies scholars with varying opinions. But I think there needs to be so much more of a space for it in Indonesia, because one thing that I highlight also in previous work is that ableism is so much a product of coloniality. I'm half Javanese and I'm Minang and Javanese. So in Javanese culture, we have disabled gods, but with the advent of colonial medicine, then the idea became, if you are different, that difference needs to be stamped out, as opposed to previously it was, this is spiritually important, you are closer to the deities, right? It's such an incredible difference in how disability is treated. So I want more communities in Indonesia to listen to the disabled people in their communities and to chart these genealogies of words, of images, right? So that we can get back to or improve upon what we knew. I do want to answer the question, what has helped me get through the last year, and I would like to thank my partner and my partner's family, the Halai, so much, and my family in Indonesia, and my friends, and trying to set little goals. Like last year, I discovered Candy Crush.
Was that a goal?
Yeah, 8 years too late. And I was like, this is actually the perfect time to be addicted to this ridiculous game. So I guess my fashionably late to the party mode was useful. And I also set goals like, okay, I'm going to read 100 books this year and all of this stuff. So little goals. But it's been difficult, as it has been for everyone. And I think we all need to congratulate ourselves more for surviving this pandemic.
Surviving, yeah.
And I don't think we think of ourselves as survivors enough. I think that especially this push to get back to normal, it actually doesn't deal with trauma or, or processing what we all went through, or prioritizing the perspectives of those of us who were made expendable with government policies, which is what I hope Molekuler tries to do. There's also a question, when you created this work, was your starting point the image or the words? My starting point was an image in my head of molecules talking and molecules being pixels, because I was reading so much about the pandemic and seeing the news images so much from the pandemic in various biomes in various parts around the world. And I was like, what is the ethics of using pixels? What are the ethics of pixels about molecules? Because we were all like thinking about these supposedly invisible virus that has had devastating consequences. So I think just the image of like a little Pixar film in my head of molecules talking and talking to each other. Two, what is the role of artists and museums now? I think it is important for all of us, certainly including myself, to think about our own complicities, past, present, and future, in terms of the harmful systems that encompass the art world, in terms of the extractivism that characterizes so much of the art world, in terms of how money from selling weapons can go into accessibility measures in a gallery in the UK, right? And how thinking of access, we can't think in terms of nation-state boundaries. We have to think in terms of the current and future colonial consequences of what the art world, quote unquote, is doing, and global finance flows.
But what about, because you're also working with archives and museums, what about beyond, art world, but also thinking about historical collections, what about with archives and collections, which will take us back to those taxonomies, not that created violence that we were discussing before?
Yes, exactly. I think the priority should be protecting Indigenous peoples at all costs. Indigenous peoples, as I said, are the best, keepers of the rainforest, but also it seems really, what is the word I'm looking for? It seems strange to think of us only in terms of our utility to other, you know what I mean? Like there should also be valuing us as human lives, right? Rather than our utility to you in terms of your imaginary. And I think that to do that, you need to follow the global finance flows and to fully divest from harmful corporations. It's actually, if governments worldwide had the political will, climate change could be solved so much more easily, because only not that there aren't over 500 companies we're talking about here with conglomerations. We're talking about like much less than that in terms of the number of companies that could actually be sanctioned, that you can divest from. Like companies that I think the BDS movement in the States, for example, against Israel and what's been happening in Palestine is something that we can look to. And there are already, movements like Strike MoMA, for instance, in the States that really connect how, people on the boards of these arts institutions are also like CEOs of weapons manufacturing companies. And all of that is very much connected to historical wealth, which is why I mentioned Drax, multiple times, because his Barbados estate was a site of slavery and continues to, the flows of that continue to enrich him now, which allows him to contribute to COVID policy. It's all
connected.
It's all connected.
But I guess I was like, and maybe the person asking this question was also more thinking in terms of display, in terms of collection. So, for example, the work that you're doing at University of the Arts with the archives.
Yeah.
And in that work, how you're thinking about the connections between ableism and racism and, of course, environmental injustice. So that I think it'll be interesting for the audiences to see how this unfolds with you working with collections and what you're doing with them as well.
Yeah. So the great thing about doing, I guess, parallel commissions is that for Wellcome, I was researching about the pandemic. At the same time, another part of my brain at that time, I finished the research residency with UAL Archives and UAL Decolonizing Arts Institute, where I still work as a research fellow. I finished that residency in January of this year. To give you sort of a timeline. So I was thinking about archives very heavily. At the same time, I was thinking about like pandemic presence.
Yes.
So sort of, I think there were certain linkages that were made in my mind about those two, certainly in terms of restitution issues, right? And in terms of what, there's this wonderful, beautiful book called Archipelago on Indonesian archives that has been translated into English as well. You can find it online. And it was produced by wonderful friends at Indonesian Visual Arts Archive. And one of the contributors, who I think is also one of the editors, Yoshi Fajar Krishnamurti, he talks about archives as having a politic of claim and a politic of access. Mm-hmm. And so I chose to work with, we all got to choose, each resident got to choose an archive, and I chose the African, Caribbean, Asian, and African Art in Britain archive, which is a long title. And I did a project, the video of which is now on YouTube, and the paper of which is online as well. The whole paper is a caption. Again, as you know, Barbara, this is my thing. I make everything I write a caption about how I wanted it to be about deaf and disabled narratives in those archives. And a big part of what I'm trying to convey is that a lot of these stories will remain, quote unquote, hidden from surveillance also, because it's not always safe for us now and in the past to disclose our disability, especially when we're people of color or from the majority world. So there are lots of artists in these archives who are, ADHD, autistic, Asperger's, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, so many things that they may not ever have disclosed to anyone in the art world or archives world because they just didn't feel safe, or they thought it would hurt their career,
or they thought that they will start reading their artworks through the lens of their disability or personal experience,
yes,
even if that's not the intention.
Yes, exactly. Well, I read disability and everything, but I think the danger is that it's so often disability is interpreted through this very ableist lens when it comes to arts and archives, that I also fear, frankly, for myself. So I'm grateful to be able to work with people who understand. I think against this sort of very neoliberal, where are the disabled artists, and can we catalog them and taxonomize them? And I want to say, in these archives, there's a lot of anti-colonial struggle, there's a lot of struggles with minoritization in Western countries, right? And discrimination because of that. That's all very much linked to ableism and health. And there are threads that you may never have access to, and that is okay. But it is to understand that there are deaf and disabled narratives in every single archive. There's the possibility of deafness and disability in every single archive. And to open up to that possibility and to the ethics of saying, I don't need to know everything, because what right do I have to know everybody's story, really, right? What purpose does it serve, right? We keep things from each other all the time. And so the ethics of that, I think, is to say there's the possibility of that in every single story, and not to want to sort of pin down, to sort of to bring it back to the sentence in Molekuler, to map other people's stations, right, in a very colonial surveillance way, because we live in a surveillance digital that's another thing about the materiality of pixels, right? Everything's recorded, everything is the property of twitter.com or Google, and it's kind of dangerous to be operating in these times. And I really respect organizations that help movements maintain privacy, movements for liberation maintain privacy. There are other questions.
Yeah, there's another question here from an audience that says, you mentioned the longest running matrilineal community in the world. Could you share more about that and how it has influenced your art practice?
Oh, so that's actually the largest matrilineal community in the world. It's not the longest.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just reading literally. Yeah.
No. But it has been, I've said that before, and then it has been written up as longest running. And I was like, no, I don't want people thinking,
largest.
So it's Minangkabau. The bloodline goes through the women. We own the property and the land. And there are Minangkabau communities in the past where husbands could only visit at night, I believe, and not during the day, and the husband would move into the wife's house. It's like and it's also really Muslim. So the interactions between being a really Muslim community and Islam in Indonesia has the most Muslims in the world, but because we have so many indigenous cultures that have been syncretic with Islam, there's so many ways of practicing it that are like vastly different from how it's practiced by, indigenous communities in the Middle East, for instance, because religion is culture, right? And so there are things like we go to people's graves and pray, and that might be seen as haram by other Muslims, right? So there's a whole in Javanese culture. So Minangkabau culture has really, I can't tell you how much it has strengthened me. Actually, that's something that did help me get through the last year, is because for that kind of feminism that predates the Western word feminism to survive, is a really strong lineage to come from. We are known for being incredibly loud, stubborn women. And as you can imagine, and I'm so grateful for that. I'm grateful for that history and like folk tales where all the women are assassins. And I actually do not know a single Minang folktale where the woman is not an assassin.
But that's interesting because I wonder what was the pre-Christian or the pre-modernity European feminism? How did that look like?
Exactly.
Because when I was little, I grew up reading these folk stories where women get to be bad and they get away with that. And moms are bad and they get away with that, which is something that obviously in the tales that come post Christianity you don't read. So I think there is these cultures and there is this kind of power in women or in other groups, kind of pre-Christianity of pre-colonization in all over the world, right?
Exactly. And there's so many elements of like even Christianity that's taken from paganism, right? Like like the dates of like, Christmas and all of this stuff. So there's been a lot of
Oh, your voice.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Yes, and I think that the ecology of the land where my mother is from is also very, very beautiful. And in terms of like the poetry there describes the ecology, like the poems that you read at weddings from my mother's village are so hyper local in terms of the ecology they describe. There's no north or south, it's downstream or upstream. So even like in terms of psychology, right, how you think about direction, it's all in the language and it's really beautiful. Sorry, I meant to answer, I think, one last question. Hello, can you further explain what is meant by vaccine apartheid and how and where is it happening? It's happening everywhere, virtually everywhere. And vaccine apartheid is something that people use to mean the economic disparity between those who get access to vaccines and those who don't get access to vaccines. A lot of the world will only get their first vaccine in 2022 if they get it, right? Because of countries cannot afford to buy vaccines. Rich countries have been hoarding the vaccines. The vaccines, like in terms of the efficacy of different vaccines, access to like better, more efficient vaccines is also stratified along economic lines. And also in terms of, not just in terms of like the West hoarding vaccines from the global majority, but also in terms of like government ineptitude and frankly like murderous policies in different countries, and fascism that is preventing people from getting vaccines. So yeah, it's, I think, and it comes from, again, looking to the past, budget cuts to local councils and budget cuts to health that have been happening with neoliberalization and all over the world. So this is what happens, unfortunately, when you cut social services, is vaccine apartheid.
And some of the consequences that we've seen of COVID-19 also, because social services were cut, and which takes back to some of the words in your poems. I think we probably need to finish now. So just to say thank you very much, Oka, for being with us here today and your generosity and transparency in all your answers. And of course, thank you from me and all the teams at Wellcome for this wonderful commission, Molekuler, which we are launching today, and which eventually will be available for researchers and for visitors to explore in our library and our collection.
Yes, in audio form also, as well as text.
In audio form, in text, and in image. And thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to everyone behind the scenes at Wellcome, and to you, Barbara, so much, and to everyone who's watching. And yeah, thank you.
And see you soon. And our museum and just to say that our museum and library is now open. So check the website before visiting, and you need to book a ticket. You can also continue to read our stories, listen to our podcasts, and browse our collection online at welcomecollection.org. Have a great evening, and thank you very much for being here with us today. Bye.
Thank you.